The snow has not stopped falling for 3 days. Inside a longhouse somewhere in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, a body lies wrapped in wool, waiting. Outside, the ground is not soft earth anymore. It is stone, frozen solid, down past where any shovel could ever reach. Someone you loved has died, and you cannot put them in the ground. Not today. Maybe not for weeks. This is not a small inconvenience. In a world where the dead were believed to walk on into another life, where the wrong burial could leave a soul unsettled, or worse, leave the dead unable to rest, this was a crisis with no easy answer. Today we bury our dead within days. We call the ground, dig the hole, close the service. For most of Viking history, that simple sequence wasn't guaranteed. For half the year, it wasn't even possible. For most of Viking history, winter didn't just delay a burial. It forced an entire community to decide what honoring the dead actually meant. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what Vikings did when the ground itself refused to open, and why the answer says more about their world than any grave ever could. To understand why this problem was so serious, you have to understand what frozen ground actually does. In much of Scandinavia during the Viking Age, winter did not simply make the earth cold, it made the earth into rock. Water inside the soil freezes and expands, locking every particle together into a mass no iron tool of the era could break. A hole that might take an afternoon to dig in summer became, in deep winter, physically impossible. Not difficult, not slow, but impossible. Archaeologists studying late Iron Age and Viking Age burial sites in Norway have pointed to exactly this problem. Researchers examining mortuary structures at Skayet in Vinjora have noted that building burial mounds and digging graves simply could not be done during the depths of a Norwegian winter. Think about what that meant in practice. Death does not wait for spring. People still died in the coldest months, from sickness, from accidents, from the simple wearing down of a hard life. And when they did, their communities faced an immediate, unavoidable question. What do you do with a body when the earth itself refuses you? There was no funeral home, no refrigeration, no way to simply wait in comfort while the problem solved itself. And in a culture where funeral rites were not optional formality, but sacred obligation, where an improperly honored body was believed to threaten the living as much as the dead, this was not a logistical hiccup. It was a test of the community's ability to keep its dead safe, honored, and on their way to whatever came next. So what did a community do, faced with a body and a season that refused them? The answer was not to fight the frozen ground. It was to build on top of it. Instead of digging down, Vikings built up. Stone, earth, and turf were piled directly over the body, layer upon layer, until the burial existed above the surface rather than beneath it. This is the burial mound, and its simpler cousin, the cairn, a mound built mostly or entirely of stacked stone. Cairns have been used as burial sites for thousands of years, in cultures far beyond Scandinavia, precisely because they solve a problem digging cannot. Piling stone requires no penetration of the earth at all. For a Viking community staring at frozen ground in the dead of winter, that made the cairn one of the only options that still worked. This wasn't a lesser substitute for a real burial. It became one of the defining images of Viking death itself. Excavations across Scandinavia, including mounds on Karmøy, on Norway's western coast, reveal a striking pattern. Vikings frequently built their own burial mounds directly on top of far older stone cairns, some dating back to the Bronze Age, over 1,000 years earlier. At sites like Grönhaug, archaeologists have found Viking-era graves resting on ancient cairns ringed with curbstones, as though the builders were reaching backward through time, borrowing the weight and permanence of something already sacred. Turf mattered too. Many mounds were sealed under a thick layer of cut turf, packed so tightly it formed an almost airtight seal over the grave below. That seal did more than mark the site. It protected what was inside, sometimes so effectively that, centuries later, archaeologists would find wood, textiles, even carved ornament preserved almost exactly as it had been laid to rest. Imagine the labor this required. No engine, no crane, just a community, working in bitter cold, hauling stone and cutting turf by hand, because the alternative was to leave someone unburied and unprotected until the thaw. That labor was the point. A mound could not be built quickly or quietly. It demanded time, sweat, and the coordinated effort of everyone who remained. In a world where digging a grave was impossible, raising a mound became the loudest possible statement a community could make. We could not put you beneath the earth, so we built the earth around you instead. For most people, a mound of stone and turf was enough. But for the highest members of Viking society, honoring the dead meant going further still. It meant burying an entire ship. Archaeologists have uncovered ships buried beneath Viking mounds in Norway, most famously at Oseberg and Gokstad. The Oseberg ship, built around 820 CE, was a wide, elegant vessel used to carry two women of clearly elite status into their mound near Tonsberg. The Gokstad ship, a more rugged, ocean-capable vessel built from oak, was buried nearby with grave goods worthy of a king. These were not symbolic miniatures. They were real, seaworthy ships, vessels that had once carried people across open water, deliberately hauled onto land, filled with the dead and everything they might need for what came next, and then buried beneath tons of earth and stone. Why a ship? For the Vikings, the ship was not just transportation. It was believed to carry the deceased onward, across whatever waters separated this life from the next. Burying someone inside a ship wasn't decoration. It was a vehicle for the soul's final journey. And even when a community couldn't afford, or didn't need, to sacrifice an actual ship, the symbolism still mattered enough to fake it. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have found mounds where the burial itself was never a real vessel at all, but rather large stones arranged in the outline of a ship's hull, pressed into the earth around the body. The shape alone was enough to send the same message. This person is still going somewhere. A ship going nowhere, and yet, in belief, going everywhere that mattered. There was one more path available, one that bypassed the frozen ground entirely. Fire. Cremation required no digging at all. A body could be given to flame, and the remains, along with whatever grave goods accompanied them, placed beneath a cairn or a mound afterward, once the ashes themselves were all that needed to be laid to rest. Some of the richest burial mounds ever found in Norway, including the Myklebust mound, held cremation graves rather than an intact body. The ground's resistance mattered far less when what remained could fit inside a hollow of stone rather than a full-length grave. But even fire could not always happen immediately. And this raises the hardest question of all. What happened to a body in the days, or even weeks, before any burial, by mound, ship, or flame, could take place? Here the evidence grows quieter, and we have to be honest about what it does and doesn't tell us. At sites like Skayet, in Vinjera, archaeologists have excavated what they believe were mortuary houses, small buildings built specifically to hold the dead. Researchers studying these structures have proposed that, since building a grave or a mound was simply impossible in the depths of winter, these houses may have served as temporary resting places for a body, keeping it safe and accessible until the ground allowed a permanent burial. It's a hypothesis, not a certainty, and archaeologists are careful to note that these houses may also have served a different purpose entirely, a place where the living could visit the dead during a transitional period, independent of any practical problem with the soil. The two explanations aren't mutually exclusive. A body sheltered against winter could, at the same time, be a body the community wasn't yet ready to say goodbye to. Either way, one thing is clear. Even waiting had to be done with care. There is something worth sitting with here. We tend to imagine Viking death as something dramatic, a sword, a battlefield, a blaze of fire on open water. But for most people, death arrived quietly, in the middle of winter, in a world that simply would not cooperate. The ground said no, and the answer was never to give up on honoring the dead. It was to find another way, stone instead of soil, flame instead of a grave, a wooden house instead of a hole in the earth, if that's what the season demanded. That's the part that outlasts the Viking Age itself. Not the ship, not the mound, not even the ritual. The refusal to let a physical barrier become an excuse to stop caring for someone. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, the best thing you can do is tell me. Leave a comment. I want to know which part of this surprised you the most. The frozen ground itself, the ship burials, or the mortuary houses. And if you haven't already, hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Before you go, if you're curious how Vikings survived when the cold turned deadly in an entirely different way, watch the video on your screen now, on how they built heat out of nothing in winters reaching -30 degrees Celsius, with no electricity at all.